Hello. Today I want to talk about what I consider to be sociology's basic insight, the idea that human beings are social beings. Most human beings exist as members of social groups for their entire lives, whether these groups be families, village communities, bodies of students, organizations we work for, or whatever. There are a few exceptions. A few adults either choose or are forced by circumstance to live by themselves, but such individuals are highly unusual. They include both religious hermits and prisoners held in solitary confinement. We should note, of course, that the isolation of these individuals occurs only after they have survived childhood. In order to have become adults, they must have been brought up in interaction with other humans during childhood. They also normally continue to have some minimal contact with others in order to get food. Complete isolation is largely, but not entirely, confined to literature, as with Daniel Defoe's famous novel Robinson Crusoe, first published in 1719, and telling the story of a man who survives alone after being shipwrecked on a remote island. This motif of a lone survivor battling against the odds has proved to be enormously appealing, with Defoe's book becoming one of the most republished and translated books of all time. The Tom Hanks movie Castaway of 2000 is a modern retelling of parts of the story. If we accept that human beings are social beings, then a key sociological corollary is that individuals are to some extent socially determined. That is, part of who we are and who we think ourselves to be as individuals is determined by our membership of the various social groups we have belonged to. The extent of this determination may vary from one individual to another, some individuals taking the social roles and attitudes they learn from their social environment much more for granted than others, and a few individuals consciously rebelling against their social environments or trying to work out alternative ideas and patterns of behavior. But even with these individuals, the reality of social determination seems impossible to escape completely. As in other areas of the social sciences, we are confronted by philosophical questions of the extent of individual freedom and autonomy. As to the ways in which human beings are social beings, I would identify four sociological processes which operate throughout the whole course of most of our lives. First, we are dependent on others for our physical, emotional, and economic survival. Secondly, most human behavior is learnt through the process of socialization into human society. Little of what we do is instinctual. We learn from our families, our friends, schools, and the wider society how to behave as human beings. Thirdly, we are social actors. A very large part of our behavior is conducted with other people in mind. We want to communicate with others, impress them, or influence them. In particular, our social interactions occur within the social groups we belong to, and our opinions about the world, our attitudes towards other people and other social groups, are at least in part determined by the groups we belong to. Finally, from birth, we are surrounded by patterns of culture and social structures which we take more or less for granted, and which enormously influence, or perhaps determine, the way in which we see the world and relate to it. In the present video I will discuss only the first of these, dependency on others, and leave the other three for other videos. Leaving aside rare Robinson Crusoe type situations, human beings depend on others by necessity. For most of us, this is a basic matter of survival. None of us could survive into adulthood without the care of other human beings. And most of us could not survive as adults without the cooperation of other humans. This dependency has three main aspects: physical, emotional, and economic. The most extreme physical dependency occurs in infancy. Unlike the young of most animal species, human infants are dependent on other members of their species for their physical survival for a lengthy period of time. They're not able to feed themselves or look after themselves. This is most obviously the case in comparison with animals low down in the evolutionary scale, such as insects and fish, which are generally capable of fending for themselves from the beginning of their lives, with little or no help from adults. By contrast, as we go up the evolutionary scale of species, the young are progressively more dependent, so that amongst mammals, the young are often completely helpless at birth, and have to be cared for by their mothers or a mother substitute in order for them to survive. This is true for animals as diverse as horses, cats, dogs, and elephants, and is particularly marked amongst primates such as humans. But even in comparison with these other species, human infants are particularly helpless, with the human child being unable to survive unaided for at least the first 4 or 5 years of life. An obvious aspect of this dependency is that human infants are initially unable to eat adult food. Like other mammals, human babies are at first reliant on their mother's milk, but the period in which they continue to rely on breast milk or a substitute is unusually long, continuing for at least several months or even longer. Even after the baby has started eating solid foods, milk continues to be an important part of its diet. Again, human neurological development is slow, with the human brain and the rest of the nervous system continuing to develop after birth. Thus, at birth, the human infant's brain is only about 24% of the adult brain size. It grows and develops in complexity after birth. Even at age 3, it is still only 70% of the adult size. By comparison, the brains of even highly intelligent baby animals, such as monkeys, are quite large, 70% of the adult size at birth, and they develop less. Similarly, with the motor neurons, the human baby's nervous system is not developed enough for it to control its own body. It cannot walk, or even crawl, or control its bladder movements. Only as the nervous system develops does the baby begin to be able to control these movements of its own body, including such very precise movements as the thumb-finger hold. This extreme physical immaturity has very important consequences, including what I would term the learning corollary. Thus, because of our physical immaturity as infants, humans are capable of an enormous amount of learning as we mature. This slow development of the human brain is linked to our high level of intelligence. This enables the growing child to later learn how to speak, as well as learning all the other complex skills of human culture, everything from gathering and hunting in so-called simple societies to farming and mathematics. This learning corollary applies across other species. The more immature and dependent the infants are, the more learning they're able to accomplish before they become adults. Thus, we can compare those animals in which there's little or no infant dependency, and the behavior of the young is almost identical to that of the adults, with those animals, such as primates, with great dependency, where there is more behavioral learning, and significant differences between the behavior of infants and adults. The obverse of the learning corollary is that the more learning the young of a species are able to accomplish, the less reliance they have on instinctual behaviors. Thus, human babies are not able to do most of the things that children later learn how to do, including basic skills such as speaking a language. By comparison, lower animals start their lives with many instinctual abilities or potential behaviors which they're quickly able to acquire. Purely instinctual human behaviors are very few. For example, babies' reflex actions relating to feeding, their responsiveness to stimuli, and the grasping reflex they make when a baby takes hold of something. It is of note, however, that some very important human behaviors are potentialities possessed by all normal children, but requiring a particular environmental context to develop. The most significant of these is language. All normal children are born with the potential to learn spoken language, and when they learn it, they do so in a particular pattern of development. But clearly individuals learn different languages depending on the language or languages spoken in their home and the environing society. Language acquisition is a biologically conditioned potential which depends on a specific environment to be actualized, and which is determined in detail by that environment. One characteristic feature of, I think, all human societies is the extent to which the period of a child's physical dependency is extended far beyond the bare minimum required for survival. This means that most older children in the world, together with a large proportion of adolescents, and even some young adults, continue to be dependent on their families for their physical survival long after early childhood has finished. Thus, family members continue to provide the growing child with food and shelter and try and protect them from danger until they are deemed old enough to look after themselves. Of course, even formerly strong adults may also require help in survival if they get ill or age. The recognized age of maturity varies from one society to another, but in all of them there is the social recognition of a transition to adulthood, which determines when an individual is expected to depend upon themselves for their own physical survival, as well as being able to adopt adult roles, both with regard to work and in marrying and having children of their own. It is of note that richer social groups in modern societies commonly extend the period of physical dependency well into adulthood, so that an individual who is already physically an adult continues to live with their parents and follows a lengthy period of education before they get a job or get married. This may lead to adult children lacking such basic survival skills as knowing how to cook or look after themselves. By contrast, in traditional societies and amongst many poorer social groups in modern societies, the age at which the individual is regarded as being old enough to be relatively independent from the family is much younger, normally in the period following puberty. The physical dependency, which we have discussed so far, normally becomes closely interlinked with emotional and psychological dependency. Thus, most children develop strong emotional ties with their caregivers. Indeed, this is an important or even crucial part of childhood experience, as can be seen in the case of those children who do not develop such ties, as with those in some orphanages, where the children are fed, clothed, and kept clean by the staff, but have no opportunity to develop emotional ties with them. In such circumstances, children commonly develop in an abnormal way. Their physical growth is much slower than other children, so that they are smaller than normal children of the same age. Their intellectual development is much slower. They are often emotionally disturbed, and they're also much more likely to die. Further evidence for the importance of emotional ties comes from Harry Harlow's famous, or infamous, study of baby monkeys. Harlow found that those babies which were deprived of maternal care developed abnormally. They were physically smaller, emotionally disturbed, frightened of other baby monkeys, and unable to relate to them, and unable to develop normal adult behaviors. In Harlow's study, maternally deprived babies, which were brought up with other young monkeys, were much more normal in their development, indicating that some compensation was possible. The circumstances of survival of gangs of street children in some modern cities is perhaps a comparable case. For most people, emotional dependency continues into adulthood, with adults continuing their emotional ties with members of their family of origin and forming families of their own and building up emotional ties with their spouses and children. The lack of such ties commonly leads to feelings of loneliness and isolation, and can be a major cause of unhappiness. It is also useful to identify the psychological needs described by psychologists such as Abraham Maslow, notably love, the giving and receiving of affection, belongingness, the sense of identity with a group, and social esteem. By their nature, such needs can only be satisfied in relationship to other human beings. Such needs may be satisfied in family life, friendship, and participation in local community, business, and other activities, and explain the importance which most people attach to such involvements. Finally, let me briefly mention economic dependency and interdependence. Human society depends on cooperation between its members in order to function effectively. Robinson Crusoe-type individuals who manage to produce all their own food and other necessities of life themselves and rely on no one else rarely exist outside of fiction. Thus, even in quite simple societies, many people obtain food, clothes, and household utensils from other people, either directly or through intermediate traders. This is even more the case in modern societies, in which we are dependent on a highly complex web of economic relationships in order to get all the various things that we need or want to use in our lives: houses, televisions, cars, petrol, and so on. This also applies within families where part of the dependency of childhood is economic. Thank you for listening. I will discuss various of these themes in other videos.